In an electrifying session that ended with the top two drivers recording the same time to the thousandth of a second, the poleman astonishingly achieved the best time on used tires, and amazingly, 3 cars were within 20 thousandths of a second of each other. This is just a brief summary of how unusual the Montreal qualifying session was. Yet, despite the surprises, the strengths and weaknesses of the cars were still evidently clear. In the third free practice session at the 4.361 km Circuit Gilles-Villeneuve in Montreal, we saw a W15 with a lot of potential. Everyone was left wondering if changing track conditions would push the Brackley team's car out of its ideal operating window, which has always been narrow and sensitive on the Mercedes, or if Lewis Hamilton and George Russell would manage to remain competitive. In reality, only George Russell seemed able to put everything together, finding a significantly better level of grip than Hamilton, who mentioned in post-qualifying interviews that the car behaved differently than in free practice. This isn't new for Mercedes, with the car being highly sensitive to varying external conditions and therefore tending to perform perfectly in one session and poorly in the next without setup changes. However, George Russell found the right setup to keep the car within the optimal range, likely helped by the green track conditions after the rain before the qualifying session in Canada, which somewhat reset to the conditions of the third free practice. In the end, in the strange Q3 session, George Russell set the pole time on a set of used tires, 0.3 slower than in Q2, with crucial help from Albon. The Williams driver was returning to the pits but maintained a high speed of over 300 km per hour on the return straight. Russell found himself perfectly positioned behind Albon at the hairpin exit and drafted behind him until the final chicane, reaching a top speed of 334 km per hour and gaining about a tenth on Max Verstappen. The young Englishman spoke about a car that has changed significantly with the latest updates, but to confirm this, we must wait for the race. Mercedes' pace simulations have never seemed exceptional, and the unpredictable nature of Q3, where conditions and especially the car's response to environmental inputs were so variable, calls for caution, particularly seeing that Lewis Hamilton ended up with the same problems as before. Let's look at the data comparing the top 3 for a clearer idea of the others' performances. The telemetry data shows that Max Verstappen was actually ahead until turn 7, thanks to a phenomenal first sector. A poor exit from turn 6, 7, and notable traction from Russell in that segment brought the Englishman level with the Dutchman. They were practically even at the exit of the hairpin, with Russell gaining a tenth thanks to Albon's slipstream. Verstappen had a great final chicane, but it wasn't enough. Generally, we noted that even in Canada, the RB20 struggled with curbs and some of the track's bumpier sections, but the countermeasures implemented by Max Verstappen himself are bearing fruit. The Dutchman seems to have found a good compromise between setup, trajectory choice, and driving style to extract maximum performance from the car, minimizing the effects of the suspension's rigidity. And this nearly put him on pole, while Perez in the other Red Bull finished P16. Once again, the Woking car proves to be the most complete, with Lando Norris just 21 thousandths off pole and Oscar Piastri right behind his teammate. The cars of the team led by Andrea Stella were the only ones to finish qualifying with both in the top 5, partly benefiting from the cooler temperatures, which generally suit them, and a higher downforce aerodynamic setup, as revealed by our calculations and their below-average top speed. Even in pace simulations, McLaren seemed fast, and this, combined with the strategic advantage of having 2 closely positioned cars, makes the McLaren duo ones to watch in the race. Regarding the poor performance of the Maranello team, which saw both drivers eliminated in Q2, the impression, as directly noted by Charles Leclerc without mincing words, is that the SF24 never had peak moments in qualifying, but instead spent the entire session in survival positions. A few small mistakes were enough to result in elimination. The evident lack of grip points to the tires, as when they do not fire up, the car becomes weak in all phases of the lap, from traction to braking to cornering speed. Analyzing the data, the time loss of Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz, compared to George Russell, who set the fastest time in Q2, showed a steady increase throughout the lap, indicating a car with clearly inferior tire performance. This is perhaps not too surprising given that in Canada 2 factors arose simultaneously. The temperatures were relatively low due to the bad weather, and the track's morphology causes cars to experience most accelerations longitudinally, in traction and braking rather than laterally, as the corners are generally low speed. This inherently transmits little energy to the tires, as the lateral deformation of the carcass in corners occurs for a short fraction of time during the lap. Combining this with an SF24 that already struggles to heat the tires due to the nature of its design results in the disappointing performance seen on track, with difficulty in qualifying already apparent during the third free practice session, which the Maranello team evidently could not rectify. Ferrari's difficulty appeared entirely in the single lap, as the long-run feedback was not as bad. However, such a qualifying result risks compromising the entire Canadian weekend for the Maranello team. For those wondering why the updates did not yield results, the reality is that the package brought to Imola did not focus on improving qualifying performance. In conditions like those encountered in Montreal, the old issue of tire heating resurfaced fully. Tire inflation pressures might also have played an important role, as they are directly linked to temperature and performance, which Vasseur mentioned several times in interviews after qualifying. Finally, we noticed a very angry Charles Leclerc after the session, which left us somewhat surprised since there were no blatant strategic errors by the team, as the Monegasque driver himself later stated. Usually, when the car lacks performance, the drivers, especially Charles Leclerc, tend to be disappointed but not necessarily angry with the team, suggesting something particularly upset the Monegasque driver. Perhaps, but this is just a hypothesis, the Monegasque had requested setup changes after the third free practice to improve single-lap performance that were not granted. All the factors we've listed lead to a Grand Prix that once again promises to be very interesting. At the front, George Russell will fight like a lion to maintain the lead, with Max Verstappen and the two McLarens likely having their chances for victory. Behind them, the Ferrari cars are called to make a possible comeback, with the uncertainty of rain potentially making the race crazy, and safety cars, a common occurrence on the Montreal track, possibly shuffling the deck even more. Ferrari is a car that does not show its peak performance in qualifying because over the winter in Maranello, they worked hard to find a better compromise than the SF23, trying to improve race pace but losing some performance on the single lap. However, the mix already seen in China and reappearing in Canada, where Ferrari hoped for a damp or rainy qualifying, is even more negative for the Italian car. The particularly green asphalt, with little grip, and its rather low temperatures, around 30 degrees Celsius, do not suit this SF24 well. It is not so much a question of a single compound. In China, the softest was the C4, in Canada the C5, but rather the inability to extract the peak grip from both axles with the softer compounds. Today, the most critical was the rear, for example, which created many problems for the SF24 as well as for Perez. This also deprived Ferrari of one of its great strengths, braking precision. Without temperatures in the tires and thus without grip, it was impossible for Leclerc and Sainz to be aggressive on the brakes. Ahead of today's Canadian Grand Prix, Carlos Sainz showed a decent race pace simulation during the third free practice session at the Circuit Gilles-Villeneuve in Montreal. But starting from such low positions, the race could be challenging for the Ferrari duo. If it's a dry race, it will be very difficult to aim for the podium and try to restore balance because Red Bull is back, which was expected, while McLaren has proven to be a complete car, with third and fourth positions on the grid. Not to forget Mercedes, which has been strong for most of the weekend so far. Much will depend on the weather conditions, as there are chances of rain that could help a potential comeback for the Maranello team.